A teenager growing up in 1976 in Soweto, Johannesburg's sprawling black township, was caught between two worlds. On the one hand, he or she shared all the concerns and interests of teens everywhere: school, sports, friends, hobbies, social life. Most were apolitical. Dissent was too dangerous under apartheid, the institutionalized system of segregation and racial discrimination. But for some, a deep and simmering resentment about the inequality of their lives, coupled with the compelling ideas of Black empowerment, were propelling them toward a violent upheaval few could imagine. All that was needed was a match to light the fire.
Before we begin, please note this episode includes discussions of torture, racism, and other forms of violence and oppression. While these conversations are important to the understanding of the topic at hand, it is important to let you know that some of you may find this content emotionally difficult or distressing. Hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Brewer, welcoming you back to this edition of M.E.S.H and to this conversation with Lynda. Lynda Schuster is the author of A Burning Hunger. Lynda worked as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the Christian Science Monitor in Africa, Central and South America. And today, our conversation is going to focus largely on the teenager who was so much a critical part of the Soweto Uprising of 1976. Lynda, welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Lynda, let's talk about this teenager who, in many ways, your book, A Burning Hunger, revolves around his burning hunger and the burning hunger of those who cared about him, the fear of his family, but certainly of the huge swath of young people he was able to organize. Tell us a little bit about him. How old was he? What's his name? Where did he live?
So the book is about the Mashinini family in general, but you're right, it focuses on Tsietsi, who was the second oldest of 13 children. And they lived in Soweto, which, as I said, was the Black township outside of Johannesburg, massive place. Soweto is basically a slum. Tsietsi was your typical teenager in many ways. He was, first of all, he was a brilliant student, absolutely brilliant student, was president of just about every club in his high school, president of the debating team, won all sorts of debating awards, was an amazing orator, great sportsman, loved karate, loved dancing, loved girls, was kind of a dandy, a little bit of a peacock, like getting dressed up and going out. That's who he was, sort of on the face of things. But he also had a very strong resentment against the government, the apartheid government. And also was pretty strongly anti-white because of what that represented to him in his life. So that's who he was as kind of a backdrop to the story that I wrote about.
There was something that happened that really propelled him in 1976 to gather himself, the people around him, the students around him, not only in his school, but in others as well. Talk about that. What happened?
So what happened was, in 1976, the government of South Africa passed a law saying that suddenly all students in the townships had to study in Afrikaans. And as I think I told you last week, this would be like the equivalent of you all of a sudden being told that you had to take your SATs and say Swedish. This was an impossibility. And this was sort of the final straw for so many of these students who had put up with just really unequal situations in their schools, lack of staffing in the schools, no supplies, really run-down schools. Sometimes they had to split their classes and half the day study outside under a tree and the other half the day in their classrooms. And so Tsietsi was part of a student sort of semi-political organization, but it had to be very low key because you couldn't do that in South Africa. And he and some of his cohorts came up with the idea of doing a protest, a march to protest the imposition of Afrikaans as the language of instruction. And his genius was that he was able and understand that all of these high schools were under the surveillance of the security forces. You couldn't go anywhere. He managed to form a committee, and then disperse to many schools, talk to the student leaders there about what was happening, and get them on board to do this protest on June 16.
How old was he?
I think he was 18, 19 years old at the time.
He sounds like a pretty scary kid for the white South African government.
Oh, he was their nightmare, because he was someone who, as I say, he was brilliant. He was and was doing phenomenally in school, was a brilliant orator. His mother had grown up, his grandfather had been what was called a praise singer at a chief's court, and was one of these people. So what a praise singer did was on the spur of the moment would create poems and songs that would honor the people there. And Mrs. Mashinini, his mother, Tsietsi's mother, was convinced that this was something he had inherited directly from his grandfather, the ability to sway people. And as his brothers told me, he would argue you into the ground. Also, another friend of his told me that his nickname was Shakespeare's friend in Africa because of his love of English literature.
That's amazing. So let's talk about this protest that he organized. Was this supposed to be a violent protest, or was this supposed to be nonviolent? What were his plans?
Absolutely nonviolent, because first of all, their belief was you lose the upper hand once. First of all, you lose your argument if it becomes violent, but also you could lose your life in a place like South Africa. So the plan was that the protest would start at certain key high schools, and none of the other students knew about it, just the leaders.
Okay.
And they would at the bell at the start of school, they would suddenly produce banners that they had made. They would tell students that they were closing down the school, there would be no school that day, and they were going to march. And that's how it was supposed to go. And then the schools were going to there were going to be streams of students marching. They would pick up what we would think of as middle school students along the way, and continue marching to a certain point where they would meet and then converge and go to a stadium.
And what did they want to have happen at that stadium?
They wanted, well, obviously there were going to be speakers, and they were going to voice their protest against the imposition of Afrikaans, and they were going to demand that it be rescinded. But it was all going to be peaceful, and there was absolutely no violence planned. And most of the students were taken completely by surprise that this had happened. One of Tsietsi's brothers told me the story that the only way he found out about it beforehand is he came home the afternoon before, and in their tiny little back garden of their house was Tsietsi and all of his fellow leaders making these banners, down with Afrikaans. And that's all they were asking for. They weren't asking for down with apartheid or anything like that. It was simply to rescind this law about Afrikaans.
So the South African government was not too thrilled with this march, this imposition on their lives. How did they respond?
Badly. The students never made it to the stadium. They began marching. Tsietsi had told a Black journalist whom he knew, a very famous one, to show up in Soweto on that morning because something was going to happen, and that he should. So he actually, there were photographers there, and there was a journalist there recording this. And Tsietsi was sort of marching on the side of the road as the students were marching. And at a certain point, they came upon a row of policemen, and the policemen suddenly took aim at the students and fired right into the crowd. And there is a which obviously dispersed everyone, and then the township just blew up. There was shooting, there was rioting, there were fires being set, but with that shooting emerged probably the most iconic photograph from that time of a young man carrying the body, the deceased, lifeless body of Hector Pieterson, who had been shot in that first volley, and his sister running behind him with her, crying with her hands held up like this in total disbelief.
And I don't know if it was that child, but I know that there were 12-year-olds who were killed by the police for attempting to use their voice.
Oh, yes. Oh, well, these were all students. These were children who were marching. And the police thought nothing of firing into them. And of course, their parents knew nothing about this. Their parents were at work. Mr. and Mrs. Mashinini did not find out about this until they came back to Soweto. They all worked in the white part of Johannesburg, and they didn't find out about this until they came home.
And later on, we won't talk about it today, but I know later on in the story, you talk about the fact that his mother was actually arrested and tortured. I want to move for a second over to one of his brothers, and you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation. M.E.S.H.
M.E.S.H.
He was arrested at some point. How old? Do you recall how old he was when he was arrested?
M.E.S.H. must have been around 16 or 17.
Okay. He was arrested. His brother did not return home in a way that the police could find him, because they would have killed him sooner rather than later.
Right.
But you describe painfully, articulately, some of the torture that many of the folks were exposed to. M.E.S.H. was the victim of special police, and one of the things that they did to him was called necklacing. Can you describe necklacing?
No, necklacing was something different. Necklacing was when, and that actually happened in the next iteration of protest in South Africa in the 80s.
Okay.
And that was a horrific thing. That was when people who were protesting would take a tire and put it over a tire that had been drenched in gasoline and put it over someone's head so that they couldn't move, and then light a match. So that was something completely different.
Okay.
What M.E.S.H. was subjected to were these various types of torture that the police kind of specialized in to try to get people to talk. And of course, the whole thing about torture is people will say whatever they can say to stop the torture from happening.
Which is one of the reasons why, at least in many sections, what we're told is that torture actually doesn't do any good. I mean, I know that there are those who believe that it does wonderful good, but there are those who say you don't get any decent intel.
No, none. People will say whatever it takes to make it stop.
By, I believe it was like late 89, late 80s, possibly 1989, when so many people had been killed, so many people had been detained. I think the number that you quote is 4,000 people had been killed. 50,000 people had been detained. Under what conditions?
So I think you may be referring to the next iteration.
Yes.
Of 84, 86. When I arrived, so I wrote this story about this family after I arrived in South Africa to cover it as a journalist. So that was 84. That was the next iteration of explosions in South Africa.
Okay.
And when I arrived, there were about 30,000 people, they think 40,000 people in detention without trial, 10,000 of whom were children. Their parents had no idea where they were or what had happened to them. But that's ultimately how I met the Mashinini family, because I was trying to make contacts in the township to be able to cover the story. And at that point, they still had, Tsietsi was still in exile. They still had 3 other sons in exile, and they were not willing to talk to me. And it was only several years afterwards, once South Africa had had free and fair elections and Nelson Mandela had been elected president, that I then returned again to South Africa to write the book about them.
Well, and I was going to say, taking a wild guess, you didn't look like them. You were a white lady
Yeah, I
from
still
the
am.
country coming to talk to them about a very frightening time in their lives. So even though when you got back, things were different, it still would have taken, I would think, a true measure of trust for them to be able to feel that it was okay and safe to talk to you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing is that it did, this was a book that took many years to research. And part of the problem with in terms of getting the information from the Mashinini family was this sort of invoked so much trauma that they had experienced that it was difficult. It was obviously very, very difficult for them to talk about. I can remember interviewing one of the younger sons, Sipiso, who was very young when his mother was arrested by the police and taken away in the dead of night. This was a young man who had now been educated at universities in Europe and had an amazing job in South Africa. And he was in his 20s and he just burst into tears telling this story because as an 8-year-old boy, he had no idea when his mother would come back, if ever.
You know, I've said it before, it does sound remarkably painfully similar in some ways. And just as a therapist, you know, one of the things that I talk to my clients about all the time is the power of using your voice. And what you describe is an entire body of people who were killed, who were tortured, who were imprisoned just because they wanted to use their voice. It was dangerous.
Exactly. And so I think to tell their story was very, very important because as a therapist, you know, obviously the salutary effect of truth and being able to tell your story. And I think that this is something else, I don't know, I'm sure perhaps many of your viewers know that after 1994 and South Africa became a democratic country, they held something called the Truth and
Yeah.
Reconciliation Commission. And
Yes.
this was a body that moved around the country, and people who had been victims of the apartheid government came and told their stories. Sadly, not many white people took part in this, but for the victims of apartheid, this was a wonderful thing.
You know, we're about to wrap up our time together, but I will say that A Burning Hunger takes us through the lives of this family, including the death of that young 18, 19-year-old boy. And even then, there were some questions. I mean, what he was alleged to have died of, but the physical injuries on his body made even the report of his death suspect. Can you speak in just for a couple of seconds about that, what that was like for the family?
Yeah. Tsietsi was in exile for many, many years and sadly did not live to see liberation, as it were, in 1994. He died just before under very mysterious circumstances in West Africa. One of his brothers brought his body back. They had no idea how he had died. And when they finally were able to view his body at the funeral parlor, there were some very suspicious signs of violence on his body. And for his mother, especially, for the whole family, but for his mother especially, this was just, it was almost beyond her being able to bear it.
Lynda, I want to thank you for the work that you have done and did and are doing now in bringing this story to the fore. I'm so pleased that it's been re-released. Please, once again, if you would, let folks know where they can pick up a copy of A Burning Hunger.
So that you can buy it on Amazon, you can buy it at a bookstore, you can buy it on my publisher's website, Ohio University Press. You can also buy it on my website, which is Lynda Schuster, com. And if you happen to be in the DC area on August 7th, you can come to Politics and Prose and hear me give a talk on the book. And I would be very, very gratified to see you.
Again, Lynda Schuster, author of A Burning Hunger, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of M.E.S.H.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And folks, thank you for joining us on this edition of M.E.S.H. I am here every week to bring you stories that have to do with things in your world that have an impact on your mental, emotional, and social health, as did, I would suggest, the conversation that we've had today. I do ask that you subscribe to the M.E.S.H. YouTube channel. We're all over social media, but certainly the YouTube channel is a place where you can get a copy of this interview and all the interviews that we've done, and hopefully share them with people that you care about. Thank you again. I'll be here next week. I hope you are as well. Take care.